Shockwaves can damage the brain in many ways. This machine over here, a shock tube, is used to create those shock waves that are made during an explosion to help study what happens to a person and their brain throughout that explosion. The shock tube is used to create these shock waves, and you can study the force and pressure that they create to help understand how the brain is affected during an explosion. Using the information gathered from these studies, we are able to better understand what the brain can withstand. Different brain models, some including harvested animal brains like pigs, are used to model as a human brain when we don't have human brains available to study. The models are placed at the end of the shock tube, and then a shock wave is sent through the tube onto the brain. High-speed cameras and sensors are able to capture the force and pressure as well as what the brain looks like when it is hit by a shock wave. The ultimate goal is to understand what happens to the compounds in the brain as they are hit with a shock wave. Here is a prepared mold of the brain. It is made of PDMS, which also stands for polydimethylsiloxane, a mineral organic polymer from the siloxane family, which means it has carbon, oxygen, and silicon atoms. Before the shock wave can be made, the shock tube has to be set up. The first task involves choosing a diaphragm made of dead soft aluminum, or more commonly just really soft aluminum foil like you use for cooking, or mylar, which is just plastic. One layer or several layers of the diaphragm can be used, and the type chosen depends on the pressure used. Here we used dead soft foil diaphragm. Next, the diaphragm is placed between two rubber plates, then in between the two main pieces of the shock tube. The driver section, which is the small section on the end, is about 1 foot long, and the driven section is the rest of the shock tube, is about 10 feet long. Then the two ends of the tube are bolted together. From there, an air hose is connected to it, the smaller end, and we used air for this test. The air will be then pushed into the driver section until there is a pressure high enough to burst the diaphragm that was placed between the two parts of the shock tube. When this happens, the force generated by the wave is so large that it bursts through the diaphragm, traveling all the way to the end of the tube to the brain mold on the stand at the other end. When using the shock tube, hearing protection must be worn because the sound made is loud enough to damage your hearing. Now that you know a little about the shock tube, you can see it in action with the test that we ran. The shock wave created is strong enough to rip through the diaphragm as if it were nearly nothing. Think about how the brain would be affected. In our case, our skull acts as the diaphragm. Now you can see shock waves are highly destructive. Imagine what would happen if you were in an explosion. Imagine how the tissues in the brain would be torn apart when the shock wave bursts through the brain. Shock tubes and shock waves have become an important part in studying the brain and how shock waves affect the brain. They can give better insight as to what happens to soldiers, for example, when they are hit by an IED, which is a type of bomb, and there's an explosion. It helps scientists and doctors to understand how the brain is affected, how their health and personality can be affected.